Imagine you're in London in the late 1950s. A seemingly ordinary couple living in a small flat suddenly becomes the center of a baffling mystery. Frank and Doris Harrison lived in a quiet little house in Kensel Rise, where nothing too wild ever happened. They argued? Sure. What couple doesn't? But little did they know, those arguments will lead to something far more sinister. And trust me, these things are gonna get weird. Frank Harrison wasn't exactly what you call a remarkable man. Born in 1920s in Hampstead, London, Frank grew up spoiled and left school at 14, quickly finding work as an office boy. He moved up to clerical position at Aaron's electricity meter factory in Kilburn, and life seemed to settle into a predictable rhythm. Then World War II happened. Frank enlisted in the RAF and spent most of his time uneventfully guarding airfields. A few fights with civilians here and there, a tumble down an underground escalator that knocked him out for 12 hours, but other than that, nothing extraordinary. After the war, Frank returned to his quiet life in his job at Aaron's. In 1948, Frank married Doris Perkins, the sister of a friend from his RAF days. Now this was no fairy tale marriage. Doris was independent, sharp-tongued, and had her own ideas about life. She didn't want children, something that Frank really resented. The couple moved into a small terrace house at 11 Dagmar Gardens in Kensel Rise. To save some cash, they rented out the downstairs flat while they lived upstairs. They were like any other couple on the surface, arguing about money, the future, and of course, Doris's refusal to start a family. Now here's where things get really interesting. By 1955, the relationship was crumbling. Doris was dealing with depression, she was threatening suicide, and eventually went to stay with her parents in Southampton. The family doctor tried to help her, but this wasn't going to be an easy fix. Meanwhile, Frank wasn't exactly handling things well either. During one of his visits to see her, he suddenly vanished for 6 days. No explanation, no note, nothing, just disappeared. When he finally showed up again, he claimed he had no memory of what happened. Doctor diagnosed him with amnesia or a dissociative fugal state caused by stress. But little did anyone know, Frank hadn't exactly been wandering aimlessly. Frank had been spending those mysterious 6 days with his mistress, Margaret Daly, pretending to be husband and wife while touring Devon. That's right. While Doris was dealing with depression, Frank was living a double life. And somehow no one had any clue about this. Now, despite all the secrets and lies, the couple reconciled, at least on the surface. They both returned to their life in Kensel Rise, but the tension was still bubbling beneath the surface. Doris went back to work at Aaron's, while Frank continued his lunchtime escapades with Margaret. And like all good scandals, this one couldn't stay hidden for long. Frank's colleague, Murdoch Hughes, happened to walk in on him and Margaret during one of their lunch breaks. But Frank wasn't just cheating. In his spare time, he fancied himself a bit of a writer. He even penned a crime thriller called The Mad Killer of Vermin Alley, a weird mix of horror and detective story. He showed it to Myrtle, asked for her feedback. And the spoiler alert, the book wasn't that great. Myrtle thought the whole thing was just pretty awful, and the manuscript ended up tucked away in Frank's desk drawer. Now at this point, Frank and Doris' marriage was just like a ticking time bomb. The arguments continued, and then came 1957, the year everything would change. Now by 57, things were just starting to unravel fast, and Frank and Doris were still at each other's throats, and the neighbors could hear the arguments through the walls. Frank was juggling his affair with Margaret and his rocky marriage with Doris, but little did they know all of the tension was building towards something much darker. On March 21st, Doris's friend Malvis Wilch, who visited every Thursday like clockwork, showed up at the house. Except this time, the house was dark. No lights, no answer at the door. Strange, but she figured maybe Doris had gone out for a bit or wasn't feeling well. She left and didn't think much of it. At least not yet. The next week, Mavis tried again, but still no sign of Doris. Now something definitely fell off here. Doris hadn't mentioned any trips or any plans to her, and it wasn't like her to just disappear. Mavis wrote Doris a letter, hoping to hear back soon from her, but instead of a response from Doris, it was Frank who showed up at her house a few days later. With a casual shrug, he told Mavis that Doris had walked out after a huge argument and gone to stay with his parents in Southampton. "Don't worry, she'll be back," Frank said, brushing it off like no big deal. But while Frank was busy making excuses, The house at Dagmar Gardens was telling a different story. An awful smell. It started in the downstairs flat, which the Harrisons had been using since their tenants moved out. Clive Woods, the estate agent helping them sell the place, noticed it at first. It hit him as soon as he walked in for a viewing. Frank blamed the smell on blocked drains, casually explaining they were in the process of fixing it. To cover it up, he placed air fresheners all over the house. Like that would do the trick, but the stench wasn't going away. Meanwhile, Frank kept living his life as though nothing was wrong. He went back to work at Aaron's, kept seeing Margaret daily on the side, and even told his father-in-law, William Perkins, that Doris had been back to the house once or twice while he was out. He was painting a picture of a woman who had simply just taken off to cool down after a fight. But as time went on, Doris's parents grew more and more worried. Easter had come and gone, and an Easter egg they had sent to their daughter was returned undelivered. Something wasn't right by May. Frank's lies were a wearing thing. Doris's parents were pushing for answers. They hadn't heard from her in months, and Frank's vague stories were no longer cutting it. He even agreed to leave a letter from them on the hall mat in case Doris decided to swing by while he was out. Yes, because that seemed realistic, right? Still, Frank did his best to keep up the charade. But then something crazy happened. Remember Myrtle Hughes, the friend who had moved away from London? She began having vivid, unsettling dreams. Every night, she dreamt of the same scene, a red fireplace from the old house at Dagmar Gardens, and that fireplace was Doris whispering softly, "Come and find me." Night after night, Doris's voice echoed in Myrtle's mind, pleading with her to come back to the house. At first, Myrtle brushed it off as a weird nightmare. But when the dream kept coming back, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened. Now, even more bizarre, Mavis Welch, Doris's other close friend, had been having the exact same dream. Doris's voice calling to her, asking her to find her. That's when the two women knew something that was horribly wrong. In June, they finally decided to act. Myrtle traveled to London to meet Mavis, and together they took the dream seriously enough to go to the police at Harrow Road Station. Now, telling the police that a dream convinced them something was wrong wasn't exactly a typical strategy, but the officers didn't dismiss them. It wasn't just a dream, it was also fact that Doris had been missing for months. That same day, Detective Inspector Henry Cox decided it was time to pay Frank Harrison a visit. Something smelled rotten, literally and figuratively. Cox showed up at the Aaron's factory and asked Frank some basic questions about his missing wife. Frank stuck to his usual story. They had a row. Doris laughed, and he hadn't seen her since. But Cox wasn't convinced. He insisted they go to Dagmar Gardens right away. Frank, now wanting to see suspicious, agreed. Now, once inside the house, the stench was undeniable. It was the strongest near the stairway. Cox pressed Frank, but Frank blamed it again on bad drains. But this time, Cox wasn't having it. He told Frank, "We're going to trace the source of that smell, even if I had to take the floorboards up." Frank probably realized he was out of options, and he stayed silent. Then Cox opened the cupboard under the stairs. Hidden behind a pile of old bed linens and timber planks wrapped in a blanket was the decaying body of Doris Harrison. She had been there the entire time. Frank's reaction? "What is it? How did it get in there?" "Yeah, because that wasn't suspicious at all, Frank." Now, Frank was immediately taken into custody, and the house was sealed off for investigation. The autopsy later revealed that Doris had been brutally murdered, multiple skull fractures caused by a violent attack. The likely weapon? An axe found upstairs, recently cleaned, but still bearing faint traces of blood. It was a frenzy of violence, and Frank's attempt to wallpaper over the bloodstains in the bedroom wasn't fooling anyone. The mattress too, it was bloodstained, further sealing his fate. Frank Harrison was officially charged with the murder of his wife. But it wasn't just a brutal crime that shocked everyone. It was the strange dreams that led to the discovery. Two friends, haunted by Doris's voice calling from beyond the grave, had been the unlikely catalyst in solving this case. Now, so the gruesome discovery of Doris' body wasn't enough, the case took an even stranger turn once Frank was in custody. You'd think at this point Frank would crack under the pressure, confess, or at least give some sort of explanation. But no, Frank stuck to his story, claiming he had absolutely no memory of what had happened. He told Detective Inspector Cox that the last thing he remembered was having a massive argument with Doris. According to him, the fight had gone out of hand, worse than they usually did. And then, as he put it, everything went black. He claimed he had recollection of striking her or what happened next. When he came 2 hours later, he found himself on a bus heading to his parents' at their house with no memory of how he got there. Convenient, right? But that wasn't the only strange thing about Frank's version of events. He said he had no idea how Doris's body ended up under the stairs. When asked about the smell that had filled the house for weeks, he just shrugged it off like it was as much of a mystery to him as to anyone else. I have no idea how that happened, he told the police, playing dumb. The man was either in deep denial or pulling one of the most ridiculous covers in history. While Frank was being questioned, the detective found something strange in his desk drawer back at the Irons factory. His manuscript for The Mad Killer of Vermin Alley. Remember the story he'd written months before? In it, a crazy killer with a hook for a hand stalks an alleyway, committing a series of brutal murders. And just like Frank's real-life crime, the killer in the story strikes during a violent rage, leaving his victims dead, and the hero of the story filled with vengeance. In the story, the killer hides his victims' bodies in a concealed space, much like how Doris' body had been hidden in the cupboard under the stairs. Now, the parallels between the story and Frank's actions were disturbing. To make matters worse, in the manuscript, the killer claims to have no memory of committing the crime at all. Does this sound familiar to you? It seemed like Frank had either been rehearsing this story in his mind long before it happened, or he'd been so wrapped up in his fantasy that he couldn't separate fiction from reality. The police took this as more than just a coincidence. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a blueprint for murder. Frank's story wasn't only a piece of terrible pulp fiction, it was in a twisted way his confession as the details of the case unravel itself. Frank's bizarre behavior became a focal point. His defense team argued that Frank wasn't in his right mind during the murder. They claimed he had suffered a mental breakdown, a hysterical fugue, they called it, brought on the years of marital stress. They pointed to his previous bout of amnesia, during which he had disappeared for 6 days, including to have no memory of his time with Margaret Daly. Maybe, just maybe, Frank's mind has snapped again. But to everyone's horror, the more investigators dug into Frank's life, the clearer it became that this wasn't a simple case of temporary insanity. While Frank played the part of the confused, overwhelmed husband, the evidence painted a much darker picture. Remember how Frank had wallpaper over the bloodstains in the bedroom? That wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment decision, it was premeditated. He had deliberately covered up his tracks, knowing fully well what he had done. His claim of not remembering, the investigators weren't buying it. In the axe, recently cleaned but still bearing traces of blood, had been found in an upstairs cupboard, carefully tucked away as though Frank was trying to erase any evidence of his violent outbursts. This wasn't the act of a man who had blacked out in a fit of rage. This was the act of someone who had thought long and hard about how to get away with murder. Frank's manuscript only added fuel to the fire. It was the kind of story that sent shivers down the spines of everyone in the courtroom. The idea that Frank had essentially written out his crime months before it happened gave the whole case an almost surreal quality. Was he living out a fantasy, or was this just a case of life imitating art in the worst possible way? And as the trial continued, Frank's defense team desperately tried to paint him as a man who had lost control, a victim of his own fragile mental state. They argued that his dissociative states, his so-called blackouts, were genuine and that Frank had no intention of killing his wife. It was, they claimed, a tragic accident. But the prosecution wasn't having any of it. They pointed out how methodical Frank had been after the murder. He had gone back to work, carried on his affair with Margaret, and even entertained buyers for the house, all while knowing fully well that Doris's body was rotting under the stairs. He had lied to everyone, his friends, his in-laws, the estate agents, without a second thought. To the jury, it was clear that Frank wasn't the victim of some psychological breakdown. He was a cold, calculated killer who had meticulously planned his wife's murder using his own twisted story as a blueprint. In the end, Frank's claims of amnesia and mental illness weren't enough to sway the jury. They didn't buy the defense argument that he was too mentally unwell to know what he was doing. Instead, they saw him for what he really was, a man who had grown tired of his wife, a man who had lived in the shadow of his fantasy world, and a man who had finally acted out the dark story he had been writing all along. Frank Harrison was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. And while justice was served, one question lingered. Had Doris really reached out from beyond the grave through the dreams of her friends, or was it just a coincidence? That, my friends, is a mystery we may never solve. Thank you for tuning in. See you in the next one.